them are a little more detailed in terms of how to directly build a skill that you're looking at. We have a design guidelines that we are going to be finalizing, but for now, we're going to be focusing on just higher level screen design.
And a little introduction on our end. My name is Heather Madanza, and I work here at Jibo as a senior designer. A little bit of background information about me. I went to school for graphic design in Boston, and I have a background in children's media design. So I have like a passion for all things fun, creating colorful visual graphics and interactions that make people smile. And here at Jibo, I work with pretty much every team from animation, voice interaction, hardware, and design, just pretty much everything, just to make sure that everything can come together and make the world's first crazy robot, Jibo. We're really excited about it. And I'm here with John Lopkin.
Hey everyone, I'm John. I'm the head of design at Jibo, and I actually started designing before screens were in people's pockets and came in so many different shapes and sizes. My first foray into screen design was for websites and web apps. And then when the iPhone and iPad came out, I moved into designing for mobile experiences. I worked for agencies and owned an agency focusing on mobile design and development for a range of clients. And then I decided to come to Jibo because of the unique challenges associated with designing for a robot, as well as the opportunity to help people on a daily basis by interacting with a robot in their home. So one of the major reasons I'm really excited about designing at Jibo is because we don't just think about designing a device or a product, but rather a cohesive character experience. These character moments help dictate design decisions and future and feature decisions. So there's a lot that goes into building a skill for Jibo. There's a lot that goes into building a skill for Jibo. The design team consists of GUI designers, so graphical user interface designers, voice user interface designers, sound designers, animators, and writers. And our lead writer, Adam Shonkoff, which I know spoke at the previous Expert Connect, adds a ton of personality to Jibo by creating Jibo's scripted responses as well as prompts. And this writing style, coupled with our sound palette and body animations and movements, complement the screen designs that we create. So we have 4 core themes that dictate how we approach our multimodal design experience. The skills we design should feel charming, in that there's no clutter or a feeling that we're trying to do too much. It's dependable in that we focus on the user experience and guide the user and offer choices for them to move forward with the experience. And we make sure that we're never just designing one screen at a time. Instead, we look at systems and the experience as a whole for a more cohesive design. And then finally, we also always look to add moments of magic so that Jibo's family feels special and looks forward to engaging with this new robot. So even though we have a screen, it's really important to remember that we also have a voice, which should really take precedence, since it's a more natural interaction and for conversation. So even though this whole topic is really about how to design for screens, it's important to remember that designing with the voice really should take precedence. And we don't want Jibo to ever turn into a phone on a body. You also want to keep in mind that Jibo has feelings and emotions of his own. It's not just about the end user you're designing for, it's also Jibo's role in the design and taking that into consideration in terms of what he's feeling and thinking in every moment that you're designing. And then finally, we have this multimodal experience that consists of, as I was saying before, voice, sound, body animation, screen animation, the light ring, and even Jibo's own emotions. So you really need to think about all of these experiences when designing for Jibo. It's not just the screen in isolation. So Heather's going to talk in a little bit about the actual screen dimensions that is on GBos Screen. You'll see that the screen is actually the same dimensions as a landscape Android phone, the 1280 by 720, which is great to think about in terms of spacing and tap targets for the screen. However, designing on Jibo is very different than designing a mobile app or a website or a video game for that matter. This is more about making eye contact. It's a very different paradigm and a different experience. It's about engaging users in a much more natural, conversational way. It's less about tapping and it's more about talking. So our screen offers a guide, a touch point, a visual touch point, and a way to visualize how Jibo is feeling and what he's thinking or seeing at any given moment. So now I'm going to hand over to Heather, who's going to talk about some of the basics of designing on the screen for Jibo.
Thanks, John. So we're just going to go over like really high level again of like just some basics, things that I love to keep in mind when I'm concepting a new skill for Jibo. The first thing you'll notice about Jibo is his eye, right? Like when he's idling or just hanging out, his eye will be right on screen there, kind of looking around, just hanging out. The eye itself is about 600 pixels, and it's actually 1/3 of the width of his head, which is kind of like a really cool like dimensions that I just love about the people who design Jibo. And his eye, we use it for a lot of things. He uses it himself to look at users, to show he's paying attention. It can glow blue to show that he's listening, along with the light ring. It can warp to show emotion, similar to that little graphic there where his eyes kind of like making a smile, we call it. And even it can transform to different emojis, which we'll talk about later, which you might have seen in some of our ads. And GBos Eye, next thing, his eye lives within the screen. And like John mentioned earlier, it's very similar to Android phones, which is 1280 by 720, and we actually have a 15 radius rounded corners on the edges. And we do this because we really want to detract attention away from the edges of Jibo's screen. Like, we want to give the illusion that his face is a whole circle. So I have some tips and tricks, my big don'ts when designing for his screen to keep that full circle illusion. We want to keep GUI and other elements kind of away from the corners and the edges of his screen. Like this little graphic on the right is kind of showing all the absolute no-nos, kind of. So we have a really small button in the upper left. We have like some text in the upper right. And his eye is getting chopped off the screen. We don't want to do any of that. We don't want to place or animate things that are going off the screen without a vignette or a fade of some kind. So we want to hide those sharp edges. We also don't want any GUI alongside Jibo's eye. It's almost similar like if you had a button on your face. You know, it just doesn't really make sense, and it kind of breaks the character. And then in addition to like the Android like phone metaphor, similar like an iOS device, right? That the target size is usually about 44 pixels. But on Jibo, we actually don't want any buttons smaller than 140 pixels. Like our buttons that we've been designing have been about as big as 330 pixels wide, because users will be using Jibo at an arm's distance away, not necessarily like really close to their face or using just their little fingers to tap the screen. More about his screen. Next, I want to talk about his emojis. These are like these really cool graphical elements that Jibo uses to talk and communicate to users. We like to think of them as Jibo's imagination, or he can transform his eye into any of these. And we kind of use these while he's talking. So if he said something like, "Oh my God, I love pizza," like we would show that pizza emoji on screen while he said the word pizza. And another way of using these graphics is also in a skill. Like if we had a pizza delivery skill, he would show up that graphic of a pizza and be like, "Oh, hey John, your pizza's on its way," and maybe show like a pizza delivery emoji or like something like that. So when we're designing skills, we like to lean on these a lot because it simplifies everything on Jibo, and it makes things like just really fun and simple and graphic, and everybody, even if you can't read if you're a kid or if you're across the room, like they're very legible and they're just so easy to read. And with Jibo, we like to say, while I'm waiting for the next slide, legibility is key. So whenever you're designing for a skill, you want to ask yourself, is this skill going to be used across the room, or is this going to be used at like an arm's distance? Like if you are up in Jibo's face using his main menu, you could use smaller elements. But if this is something that you want to be using casually from across the room, the user might be yelling out across the room, or Jibo might be trying to get somebody's attention. We don't know where the user is, So that's something I love to keep in mind. And when I'm going to go to the next slide for a second. When we were choosing a font family for GBos Screen, we tried to find a font that was known for its legibility and something that also matched kind of Jibo's personality. So we picked the Proxima Nova family. It's like, I don't know if we have any typography nerds here on the stream, but we use Proxima Nova Soft because it's like, round, just like him, and really friendly for all of our like headers. And then we also use Proxima Nova Light for all our smaller captions or button labels. And so these are two graphs that we did to find out what was the optimum size for each one of these for legibility. So like if you're using something that needs to be read from across the room, we want to use the header at about like 120 points, right? And if we're using the smaller one, we actually don't go any smaller than 45 points because hopefully your arm isn't longer than 6 feet, you know what I mean? So that's something, a little insight into our typography choices that you'll have access to in the SDK, or you should have access to. And then next is kind of like leads into how we're kind of simplifying everything and like keeping things as legible as possible and glanceable. We're using kind of like a familiar digital color palette for the GUI, right? Like most of the time delete buttons or destructive buttons are red. So on Jibo, right, we're using for every red button like a delete or a cancel or no, or even like the shutdown button, right? Those are all red. And like more confirmation buttons like save and okay, those would be the limeade color, the green color. We also have a few like the more generic buttons, like similar like on your laptop, those would be gray. On Jibo, they're blue. And then we're also using Metro and Pearl, the gray and white colors, as kind of like accents for the icons on top of those buttons. And you should have, I know there was a question about having access to those icons, and you should definitely we're working on a big collection for you guys to use for that. So we're all using the same kind of GUI system throughout. And the simplicity is key, because Jibo's already such an interesting device, and a lot of people are going to be unfamiliar with using it. So we want to keep it as simple as possible, and overall just kind of like less is more is what I'm trying to get to.
Yeah.
Like keeping it simple and like just really digestible for everybody to use.
Yeah, and I think also, as Heather was saying, we have to keep in mind that the screen is black, so in terms of legibility and readability, to make sure that everything really pops on this screen is really key. Mm-hmm. So even though I mentioned earlier that designing for Jibo is way different than designing for any other interface, there is one main design principle that carries over, and that is less is more. It's very similar to dealing with the dimensional constraints of a mobile device, for example. We never want to overwhelm users with cluttered screen or too much content that people could potentially lose focus and don't know what to do next. We really want to focus the user with everything we're doing, again, because there's a lot that's going on with this multimodal experience. So when designing skills on Jibo, and specifically GBos Screen, remember that his interface is in fact his face. So keep iconography, imagery, color, and typography, just as Heather was talking about, legible, readable, simple, and focused. Sometimes you only really need one element on the screen to convey an idea to the user. So don't just think about what people will see on his screen, but also, as Heather points out, distance. And you want to think about the environment that they're in, what their surroundings are, how will they look at his screen, how far away they are, and their overall intentions for the skills that you create. So that is that is everything. We are very excited to see what you guys come up with and add to Jibo's repertoire.
Yeah. We're open to
some questions and answers.
Questions you guys have?
We had some questions about the emojis. Will they get, and I know you answered them, but just to repeat so
definitely.
everybody was clear, will they have access to that library?
Definitely. I would love it if all the developers had access to our emojis. Just so like for Jibo, like I said, it's part of his like imagination. Like the way Jibo thinks of an umbrella, right? Like is that we have like a blue emoji for his umbrella, like that's his umbrella, right? And like I think we're still thinking about like custom emojis, like how that process will work. But we're working on our library of emojis every day, making it larger for everybody to use.
And then also, not that you would necessarily need to create your own emojis because we would have a library, but we've talked about deconstructing emojis and posting maybe a blog post or putting that on the design guidelines to clue in people exactly how we came up with emojis and how we constructed these, which I think would be helpful for people to see.
We do have some like guidelines. We have a really strict color palette that we use for those, and some other rules like on line thicknesses and shapes and stuff. We can show our faces.
I think people are interested,
curious
to
and see who we are.
Who you are.
Hi everybody.
Such an attractive team too.
So I'm Heather. And this is John. Obviously, I know he could be a Heather, but
today I'm John.
Today he's John. Trying to see if we have
any other
questions.
Oh yeah. So the eye and light ring. Do they go when they go blue and they're listening? Will developers need to program that? Or will it happen automatically when a question mim is used?
Definitely automatically. We want to take as much load off of the developers as possible of things that we want to be consistent throughout the whole Jibo experience, and that is definitely something that, we don't want to make it confusing for users to, like, oh, how will I know he has my attention in this skill versus that skill? So that will be definitely, I think, a standard thing.
In terms of developers needing to get a license for Proxima Nova, I believe that it actually comes
it should be in the SDK. We, it does not? Not right now? Oh, just kidding. I thought we...
Next update.
Well, in the next update, that's what they're saying. Sorry, everybody. Sorry. Yeah.
Do you have any advice for developers who might want to create their own content? Could they just use clip art? Could they should they have a visual designer on staff which might be a big ask for a lot of our smaller third parties?
Yeah, so I think ultimately with everything that you're creating, you want to make sure that the feature comes first and the user experience comes first with everything you're doing. In terms of using clip art, you want to get something that is licensed. I think that's really important. Ideally, you would make your own artwork, and if that means working with a designer, that's ideally the best case scenario. If that's not feasible, I think you want to just follow a lot of the principles that we talked about here, and also when we release our design guidelines documents, that will help in terms of when you're creating new artwork for Jibo. Again, it's all about keeping things simple and focused and legible for the user and not putting too much on the screen when it's not really necessary. So I would definitely keep those principles in mind.
And hopefully when we release all of our emojis for you guys to use and icons, hopefully it'll be robust enough that you won't have to make so many custom things. But I'm sure there'll be things that you guys will have to need by yourself. Yeah. What John said. Yeah.
Yeah, so one of the questions that just came in is how have you guys approached the personality differences between an older user versus younger user, and how do you design accordingly? So it's a great question, and it's something that we think about a lot in terms of the personas that we're designing for, because that really dictates the features that we build and how we design. So right now, because obviously we haven't launched, we don't have exact data on how many people are older users versus younger users, but we have done some beta programs here where we've tested with a range of users. And what we've seen is the older audience that tend to be parents and families are usually using Jibo more as in a utility-focused way, whereas a younger user, the children, are using the features that are focusing more on game-like features. So that's really been kind of dictating how we've been designing there.
Yeah, and definitely things like we've noticed that younger users are more likely to ask Jibo to dance, or like, hey Jibo, tell me a joke, and just more like just more fun overall. They're really interested in just like hanging out with Jibo. And we've noticed some older users are also interested in having Jibo as like a companion. Like that's definitely like the overall topic. But like older users are more likely to use Jibo as like a timer or an alarm or in the kitchen. So like versus like a younger person.
Yep.
Do you have any recommendations for using multimedia on the screen? We know that we don't want it to look like a mobile device.
Mm-hmm.
That idea that it's just a screen stuck on Jibo. So do you have any tips if you have movement or maybe video, or is that forthcoming in the design guidelines?
By multimedia, do you mean like videos and pictures and stuff? We do. So in one of the slides I showed a full screen one. He can show photos and videos full screen. Like in future skills. I'm not sure.
So we will have, if we ever show multimedia where there is an image or a video on the screen, it's really important that that's a situation where an image could potentially bleed off the edge, and that's a circumstance where we want to keep in mind that rounded corner on the faceplate. But in terms of the exact multimedia, those skills are still being worked on and being finalized.
Yes, that's what I was like, how do we say that? Definitely.
We have lots of developers that are thinking of different skills that they want to develop, so even if we don't have the answers now, I think it's useful as you guys are finalizing those design guidelines to consider some of these questions.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, definitely. Like
and then we'll share that back out to the community when they're finalized.
Yeah. Like we've added the rounded corners on GBos Screen to kind of help make it look more purposeful. Like this is Jibo as a full screen, right? It's like not just a square. It's a little bit like more thought of, like when we're showing that full screen stuff. So we are anticipating him showing full screen multimedia, I guess is the base.
And you'll be able to swipe on that media as well to advance and kind of use it as in similar ways that you would use a mobile device. But again, just as I mentioned before, voice plays a big part with everything we're doing, so we don't want to necessarily keep something up on the screen for too long where you're just staring at the screen. It's all about that natural conversation and having that back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Yeah.
If we didn't get to your question, we'll certainly answer those in the forum, particularly if you have a question that seems more specific to the design of your particular skill rather than the generic and overview, high-level stuff we've been talking about today. One last question snuck in under the line.
Sure.
What are the best uses for the light ring? Is it just for denoting when Jibo is listening, or should they use it as a full extension throughout their skill?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it really depends on the circumstance and on the skill. It's something that right now we're really just using as a listening state, specifically the blue color. If it is like a mood skill or something like that, where you want to change the mood in the room or something like that, where you could change the color on the light ring and it could go in different colors, that would be interesting. But for right now, we're really focusing on keeping the principle of having the light ring be blue to denote that he's listening.
Yeah, I think we're still kind of discussing like what freedom we will give outside of the user, what the users. What I want to say is like, if something's on GBos Screen, right, that will be the only indication of that GBo's listening to the user. So we really want to be careful of what we're doing with the light ring, like similar to Amazon Alexa or Google Home, how they have their lights that show that they're listening. Like this is like one of our core like usability things that we want to be really careful with what we do and what we don't do with it. Like right now we have really on our end like really strict rules with like what we're using it for. So I just want to be a little careful of what we do with it, I guess is what I'm saying, what the point is.
And again, if you're using a MIM, that light ring will automatically come on if Jibo is meant to listen.
Mm-hmm. And it's also kind of like a security thing as well. Like if users are like concerned that Jibo's always listening or whatever, like they need to see that to know that, okay, now he's listening to what I'm saying.
Right.
If there are any additional questions, post them in our forum. We'll give you answers there. We'll also put the slides that Heather and John shared with the live streamers, our dev group, up on the forum